Caleb adjusted his backpack and turned around to smile at her, ready to make a joke about how steep the incline had become, but the words died in his throat. The trail behind him, which had been filled with the sound of her boots crunching on autumn leaves just seconds ago, was empty. There was no scream, no struggle, just a wall of white mountain fog that had descended in the blink of an eye. He laughed nervously, thinking she was hiding behind a hemlock tree. "Jules?" he called out. The only answer was the wind sighing through the canopy. He didn't know it then, but that silence would last for the rest of his life. There is a saying among the old-timers who live in the shadow of the Great Smoky Mountains. They say that the mountains breathe. If you stand still long enough on a high ridge, watching the blue haze settle over the valleys, you can see the slow inhalation of the mist rising from the trees, and the heavy exhalation of the fog rolling down the slopes. It is a beautiful sight. It is one of the reasons millions of people flock to the jagged border between Tennessee and North Carolina every year. They come for the peace. They come for the ancient majesty of a forest that feels like it has stood since the beginning of time. But for Caleb Thorne, the mountains are not beautiful. Not anymore. For Caleb, the mountains are a thief, a silent, grand, indifferent thief that took the most precious thing he ever held and gave him nothing back but silence. This is not a story of monsters or crime. It is a story about how quickly the world can change, about how a perfect Tuesday in October can become a lifetime of wondering what if. It was supposed to be their 5th anniversary. Caleb and Julianne had been planning this trip for 6 months. They were the kind of couple that made other people believe in soulmates, though they would have laughed if you told them that. They were best friends first. They lived in a small apartment in Knoxville, working jobs that paid the bills but didn't ignite their souls. Their real life happened on the weekends. Out in the wild, they had hiked the sections in Virginia, camped in the bold mountains of North Carolina, and kayaked the rivers of West Virginia. They were experienced. They were careful. They respected the woods. Julianne was the spirited one. She was small, with hair the color of dried wheat and eyes that seemed to notice everything: rare bird, a strange mushroom, the way the light hit a particular rock. Caleb was the anchor. He was steady, strong, the one who carried the heavier pack and checked the weather reports 3 times before they left the house. On the morning of October 14th, the sky was a piercing, brilliant blue. It was the kind of autumn day that photographers dream of. The air was crisp, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. They parked their car at the trailhead of a lesser-known path near the deeper western side of the park. It wasn't a tourist trap. It was a rigorous, winding trail that promised a view of the valley that few people ever saw. "Race you to the tree line," Julianne had teased, tightening the laces on her boots. "You know, I don't run on an incline," Caleb laughed, locking the car. "Slow and steady, Jules. We have all day. We have all our lives," she corrected him, grabbing his hand and squeezing it. They started the hike at 8 a.m. The mood was light. They talked about everything and nothing about the house they wanted to buy next year, about whether they should get a dog, about the funny thing Caleb's brother had said at dinner last week. The forest was vibrant, painted in shades of russet, gold, and deep green. By noon, they had reached the halfway point. They stopped for lunch on a large, flat gray stone that overlooked a sea of trees. They shared sandwiches and an apple, passing a canteen of water back and forth. Caleb remembers looking at her then. The wind had whipped color into her cheeks. She looked radiant, alive, and so completely at home in the wild. He took a picture of her looking out at the horizon. It was the last picture he would ever take. "Ready to push for the summit?" Caleb asked, packing away the wrappers. Always, she smiled. As they ascended, the terrain changed. The trees grew denser, closer together. The air grew cooler. This is typical in the Smokies. The weather at the base is rarely the weather at the peak. Clouds were beginning to gather, but they looked high and harmless, just wisps of white drifting lazily across the sun. Around 2 p.m., the atmosphere shifted. The wind died down completely. The birds, which had been chattering all morning, fell silent. It was a heavy, noticeable silence, the kind that makes your ears ring. "It's getting quiet," Julianne whispered. She was about 10 yards behind him. "Just the elevation," Caleb called back without turning around. "Watch her step here. There's a lot of loose root systems." "I see them," she said. Those were the last words she spoke to him. Caleb navigated a tricky switchback, stepping over a fallen log. The trail curved sharply around a massive outcrop of granite. He walked for maybe 30 seconds, his eyes on the ground, scanning for stable footing. When the path straightened out, he stopped to wait for her. It was a habit. He never let her get too far behind. He waited. He counted 210 in his head. Usually, she would pop around the corner, slightly breathless, smiling. He didn't see her. "Jules," he said. His voice sounded flat in the thick air. "Nothing." "Julianne." He called louder this time. He assumed she had stopped to tie her shoe again, or maybe she had seen a deer and was staying quiet so as not to spook it. He turned around and walked back to the granite outcrop. He rounded the corner, expecting to almost bump into her. The trail was empty. It was a straight shot of about 50 yards back to the previous turn. There was nowhere to hide. On one side was a steep, rocky wall going up. On the other was a sharp drop-off into a ravine filled with Caleb's heart skipped a beat of physical thud in his chest. "Julianne," he screamed. Panic is a strange thing. It doesn't always hit all at once. At first, it's confusion. Caleb jogged back down the trail, his eyes scanning the woods. Maybe she stepped off the path to use the bathroom. Maybe she dropped something. "Jules, this isn't funny," he yelled, spinning in a circle. And then the weather turned. In the Smokies, the fog can move faster than a man can run. It poured over the ridge like water, a thick, milky white blanket that reduced visibility to 5 feet in a matter of seconds. The temperature plummeted. Caleb began to run. He ran back to the spot where they had last spoken. He ran forward again. He checked the edge of the ravine, terrifying images flashing in his mind, her slipping, falling silently into the brush below. "Julianne!" He scrambled down the side of the ravine, tearing his pants on the thorns. Sliding in the mud, he screamed her name until his throat was raw. He listened. He stopped and held his breath, praying for a moan, a cry, a rustle of leaves. But the woods were dead silent. The fog swallowed the sound of his voice. It felt like he was screaming into a pillow. He checked his watch. It had been 20 minutes since he last saw her. 20 minutes. How could a human being vanish in 20 minutes? He pulled out his phone. No signal. Of course, Caleb didn't leave the spot for an hour. He grid-searched the immediate area, moving in frantic circles. He found her footprint in a patch of mud near the granite wall. It was fresh. Etote, his finger, tracing the tread of her boot. It was proof she was there. And then, a few steps later, nothing. No scuff marks. No broken twigs. Just the undisturbed floor of the forest. As the light began to fade, turning the white fog into a gray, oppressive gloom, the reality set in. He couldn't find her alone. He had to get help. The run back down the mountain was a blur of terror. Caleb fell multiple times, scraping his hands, bruising his knees, but he didn't feel the pain. He reached the car. As the sun was setting, he drove like a madman to the nearest ranger station, bursting through the doors, breathless, wild-eyed, covered in mud. "My wife!" he gasped. "She's gone." The search began that night, but searching the Great Smoky Mountains in the dark, in the fog, is nearly impossible. The rangers, equipped with powerful flashlights and tracking dogs, moved up the trail. Caleb wanted to go with them, but they made him stay at the trailhead, wrapped in a shock blanket, staring at the black wall of trees. The dogs picked up her scent. They followed it up the trail, past the lunch spot, to the granite outcrop. And there, the dogs stopped. They circled. They wind. They didn't pull toward the ravine. They didn't pull further up the trail. They just sat down. The handler looked at the ranger and shook his head. "It ends here," he said. "It's like she evaporated." The next 3 weeks were a blur of misery. The search expanded. Volunteers came from 3 states. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew over the canopy, looking for a heat signature. Hundreds of people combed the woods, shoulder to shoulder, poking through the brush with sticks. Caleb didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He spent every daylight hour in the woods, calling her name. He slept in his car at the trailhead, terrified that if he left, she would walk out of the woods and he wouldn't be there to meet her. His parents came. Julianne's parents came. There was crying, praying, and the awful, suffocating tension of waiting for a radio crackle that would bring bad news. Because after day 4, everyone knew they weren't looking for a survivor anymore. The temperatures at night were dropping below freezing, but they found nothing. No backpack, no water bottle, no jacket. The police investigated Caleb, of course. The husband is always the first suspect. They interrogated him for hours. They checked his phone, his finances, their marriage counseling records, which didn't exist because they were happy. They searched his car. They found nothing to suggest foul play. His grief was raw, ugly, and undeniably real. Eventually, the volunteers went home. The helicopters stopped flying. The news crews packed up their cameras and moved on to the next tragedy. The official search was suspended on November 10th. The lead ranger, a kind man with tired eyes, sat Caleb down in his office. "The woods are vast, son," he said gently. Sometimes the mountain just keeps things. We've done everything we can." Caleb nodded. He didn't argue. He felt hollowed out, as if his insides had been scooped away, leaving only a shell. He returned to their apartment in Knoxville. It was exactly as they had left it. Her book was still on the nightstand, a bookmark halfway through. Her coffee mug was in the sink. Her smell of lavender and vanilla was still on the pillowcases. For the first year, Caleb lived like a ghost. He went to work, but he didn't really work. He came home and sat in the dark. He kept a phone line active, paying the bill every month, calling it just to hear her voicemail greeting. "Hi, you've reached Julianne. Leave a message, and I'll call you back. I'm waiting, Jules." He would whisper into the receiver. "I'm still waiting." He couldn't accept it. Without a body, without a goodbye, the brain refuses to process death. There is always that sliver of irrational hope. Maybe she had amnesia. Maybe she was found by someone living off the grid. Maybe she walked out of the woods on the other side of the mountain and was looking for him right now. Every weekend, Caleb drove back to the Smokies. He hiked that trail. He knew every rock, every root, every tree by heart. He placed flyers at the trailheads, even though the photo was fading and peeling in the rain. 5 years passed. Then 10. Caleb didn't remarry. He didn't date. He became the quiet man at the end of the bar, the one with the sad eyes, who looked at the mountains with a mix of longing and hatred. He moved closer to the park, buying a small cabin in Gatlinburg. He wanted to be close. Just in case, the mystery of Julianne Thorne became local folklore. Campfire stories were told about the woman who vanished into the mist. Some said it was a bear. Some said it was a sinkhole that opened up and closed again. Some, the superstitious ones, whispered about the feral folk or the spirits of the Cherokee who didn't want strangers on their land. But for Caleb, it wasn't a ghost story. It was a love story that had been interrupted. On the 20th anniversary of her disappearance, Caleb was 52 years old. His hair was gray. His knees ached when the weather turned cold. He decided to make the hike one last time. He felt it in his bones. He couldn't keep doing this. The grief had changed from a sharp knife to a dull, heavy stone he carried everywhere. It was October 14th again. The weather was identical to that day 20 years ago. Blue skies, crisp air. He walked slowly. The trail hadn't changed. Ibn Fayad. He reached the granite outcrop around 2 p.m. He sat down on the mossy ground. "I miss you, Jules," he said aloud. The wind rustled the leaves, sounding like a sigh. He sat there for an hour, just remembering. He remembered the way she laughed, the way she held her fork, the way she looked at him when he woke up in the morning. As he went to stand up, something caught his eye. Down in the ravine, the landscape had shifted slightly over the years. A massive oak tree had fallen during a recent storm, its roots tearing up a section of the earth that had been covered in thick rhododendron bushes for decades. Something metal glinted in the dirt, caught in the uplifted root ball of the fallen tree. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. He slid down the embankment. Ignoring the pain in his joints, he scrambled over the rotting log and fell to his knees in the mud. It was a trekking pole. Not just any trekking pole. It was blue aluminum, with a specific scratch near the handle where Julianne had dropped it on a rock in Virginia years before. He knew that scratch. He had teased her about damaging their gear. He dug frantically with his hands, tearing at the soil. A few feet away, buried under 20 years of leaf litter and soil shift, he found the corner of a decomposed backpack, and inside a small, sealed waterproof pocket of that bag, he found a digital camera. Caleb sat in the dirt, clutching the muddy camera to his chest, and he wept. He wept for the first time in years. It wasn't the body, it wasn't her, but it was proof. She hadn't left him. She hadn't run away. She had fallen. The rangers speculated later that she had likely stepped off the trail for privacy. The ground had given way into a concealed sinkhole or a hidden crevice, and the thick brush had immediately snapped back, covering the hole. She had fallen into the earth, and the mountain had closed over her instantly. Caleb took the camera to a specialist. The memory card was corroded, damaged by moisture and time. They said it was unlikely they could recover anything. But Caleb waited. He was good at waiting. 3 months later, he got an email. They had managed to salvage one image. The last image taken on the card. Caleb sat at his computer, his hand trembling on the mouse. He clicked the file. It wasn't a picture of the view. It was a selfie. It was blurry, taken in low light, likely accidental as she fell or immediately after. It was just a wash of gray and brown, but in the corner of the frame there was her hand, and on her finger The wedding band caught the flash. She was there. She had been there the whole time. Just beneath his feet, while he screamed her name into the air. It wasn't a happy ending. There was no reunion. But there was an answer. Caleb printed the photo. He framed it and put it next to the one he took of her at lunch that day. The before and the after. He stopped hiking the trail after that. He didn't need to search anymore. He knew where she was. She was part of the mountain now. She was in the roots of the oak trees, in the mist that rose from the valley, in the silence of the ridge. He still lives in the cabin in Gatlinburg, and every evening, when the fog rolls down from Klingman's dome and settles over the town, Caleb sits on his porch with a cup of coffee. He watches the mist swirl around the porch lights. He doesn't feel the panic anymore. He just feels a quiet, Hentley sorrow. He knows that one day the mist will come for him too. And finally, after all these years, he will follow it into the woods, and he will find her, and they will finish the hike together.